Number 1. The Warhammer. The year is 1996. A quiet field near Visby, on the Swedish island of Gotland. A team of archaeologists is excavating a mass grave first discovered decades earlier. The site of the Battle of Visby, fought in 1361. You kneel down in the dirt. In front of you is a skull. It isn't cracked. It isn't cut. It's punched through. A small, near-perfect circular hole straight into the cranium. At first, researchers assume it's an arrow wound, but the shape is wrong. Too round, too deep, too clean at the edges for any arrowhead in the historical record. Here's where it gets strange. Researchers at the University of Lund would eventually study over 1,100 skeletons from this site, one of the largest medieval mass graves ever examined. Many still had armor fused to their bones by centuries of corrosion, and several skulls showed the same signature wound. A hole, not a slash, not a crush. A hole punched clean through solid bone. You set the skull down carefully, the way you're trained to, but you can't stop looking at it. Whoever swung the weapon that made this wound wasn't aiming for a limb, or a shield arm, or anywhere that might leave a survivor. They were aiming for the one place a helmet was supposed to make impossible to reach. The weapon responsible is the warhammer, and by the 1300s, it had become one of the most feared close combat weapons on the European battlefield. Its design is deceptively simple. A hammerhead on one side, for blunt force trauma against plate armor, and on the reverse, a spike. Narrow, reinforced, engineered for one purpose only: to punch through steel. Plate armor could deflect a sword strike almost effortlessly. The curved surfaces were designed exactly for that, to glance blades away. But a hammer doesn't need to cut. A hammer just needs momentum. Swing it hard enough, and the force doesn't care how strong the steel is. It will crack or break or shatter.
It transfers straight through the metal into the skull, the ribs, the spine underneath.
But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part is what the spike could do that the hammer couldn't. A concentrated point, swung with enough force, could punch through even hardened plate, not by brute, blunt trauma, but by focusing all that force onto a single tiny area. Physics working against the wearer's own protection. Mounted knights carried shortened versions one-handed. Foot soldiers wielded massive two-handed warhammers, some designed to hook an opponent off a horse entirely. Museum collections across Europe hold dozens of surviving examples, many with reinforced steel heads mounted on wooden shafts wrapped in metal langets, strips of steel running down the handle specifically to stop an opponent from severing the weapon in a desperate counterattack. Even the handle, it seems, was engineered against retaliation. And this is where everything changes. Because the warhammer wasn't an isolated invention, it was a response. Somewhere around the 13th and 14th centuries, European armor had gotten too good. Mail alone could no longer stop a determined attacker. Plate steel emerged to fix that, and weapon makers immediately began engineering the next answer. The warhammer wasn't the end of that arms race, it was only the beginning. Number 2. The Bec de Corbin. The year is the early 1400s, Burgundy, France, a blacksmith's workshop lit by a single forge fire, tools scattered across a stone table, and on that table, something that doesn't quite look like any weapon you've seen before. It has a hammer face, a hook like a bird's beak, and a spike on top like a spearhead. 3 weapons fused into one shaft. You pick it up. It's heavier than it looks, the weight distributed deliberately along the haft, balanced for controlled swings rather than wild ones. This wasn't made for a farmer defending his home. This was made by someone who understood exactly how a knight moves, exactly how a knight falls, and exactly how to make sure he doesn't get back up. This is the Bec de Corbin, literally crow's beak. Here's where it gets strange. Historians still debate exactly how widely this weapon was used because so few identical originals survive today. Most of what we know comes from period artwork, armory inventories, and a handful of preserved specimens in collections like the Wallace Collection in London and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. But the design tells its own story. The hammer face crushes. The hook, the beak, was designed to catch the edge of a knight's helmet, breastplate, or shield and yank the wearer off balance or off his horse entirely. And the spike on top finishes the job. This wasn't a weapon built for open battlefield swings, it was built for something more calculated, more surgical. A knight in full plate wasn't just protected, he was stable.
Hard to knock down, hard to disarm. The Bec de Corbin was engineered to solve exactly that problem. Destabilize first, then destroy. But the next discovery was even stranger. Some later variants of the Bec de Corbin included a small hammer designed specifically to fit inside the visor slits of a great helm. A tiny, brutal detail suggesting these weapons weren't just built to defeat armor in general. They were built to defeat specific armor, specific helmets, specific weaknesses that blacksmiths had studied and mapped out. Which raises an uncomfortable question historians still can't fully answer. How much direct communication was there between armor makers and weapon makers? Were they rivals? Or, in some documented cases, literally the same guilds, engineering both sides of their own arms race? We don't have a clear answer, but we do know the next weapon on this list takes that idea even further. Number 3. The estoc. The year is 1415, northern France. The battlefield of Agincourt. Mud everywhere. Rain-soaked ground churned into a swamp by thousands of boots and hooves. English longbowmen have already unleashed a storm of arrows into the advancing French knights. And now, in the chaos of close combat, something strange is happening. Knights in full plate armor are being killed. Not by axes, not by hammers, but by something that looks almost like an oversized needle. This is the estoc, a sword with no cutting edge at all. You watch a knight draw it from where it hangs at his saddle, not his hip, his saddle, a second weapon carried specifically for this moment. He grips it with both hands, blade extended like a spear, and drives it forward into the press of bodies ahead of him. There's no swing, no arc, just a straight, controlled thrust, aimed with unsettling precision. Here's where it gets strange. Blades had ruled European combat for over 1,000 years by relying on their edge, the sharpened side that slices through flesh. But against plate armor, an edge is almost useless. It can't bite into hardened steel. So sword makers removed it entirely. The estoc is a long, rigid, usually triangular or diamond-shaped blade, built purely for thrusting. No edge to sharpen, no curve to slash, just a stiff, needle-like point backed by the wielder's full body weight. Knights carried it strapped to their saddle, specifically for the moment mounted combat broke down into a grinding, close-quarters brawl. The exact kind of fight that happened at Agincourt. In that chaos, an estoc could be driven into the gaps of armor, the eye slits of a visor, the joints at the armpit, the small, unprotected seams behind the knee. Surviving examples, held today in collections including the Royal Armories and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, show blades that are often square, triangular, or diamond in cross-section, a shape chosen not for elegance, but for rigidity. A flat blade can flex or snap under the force of a full-body thrust against hardened steel. A reinforced spike-like cross-section won't. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part is how precise this weapon demanded its user to be. A warhammer could succeed through raw force alone. The estoc required knowledge. A fighter had to understand exactly where the human body was vulnerable beneath a suit of plate steel, and exactly where the armorer had been forced to leave a gap for the body to move at all. Fighting manuals from the period, called Fechtbücher, produced by German and Italian masters, actually diagram these targets. Some of the oldest surviving European martial arts manuscripts include detailed instruction on exactly how to kill a fully armored opponent using precision thrusts alone. Which means something unsettling. By the 1400s, killing a knight in full plate armor wasn't just physically possible. It had become a documented, teachable skill. And that wasn't the last weapon on this list built for precision over power. Number 4. The poleaxe. The year is 1417, a siege somewhere in Normandy. You're standing on castle walls that have held for generations.
stone that has repelled attackers for over a century. But the real danger isn't the walls today. It's what's happening at the base of them, men fighting hand-to-hand in the confusion of a breach, armored knight against armored knight, in a fight where swords have already failed. And in the middle of it, one weapon keeps appearing again and again in the historical record: the poleaxe. Two knights face each other in the breach, both fully armored, both carrying the exact same weapon. This is no longer about who has better protection. Their armor is nearly identical. What decides this fight is something else entirely: training, timing, and which man finds the gap first. Here's where it gets strange. By the 15th century, the poleaxe had become, according to many arms historians, the preferred weapon of choice for knightly single combat, not the sword most people imagine. Why? Because it was the ultimate answer to plate armor: a hammer face on one side for blunt trauma, a spike or axe blade on the other for penetration, a long spike on top for thrusting into visor slits or joints, 3 killing methods, 1 shaft, wielded with both hands for maximum leverage and force. Manuscripts from fencing masters like Fiore de' Liberi, writing around 1410, include detailed illustrated techniques specifically for poleaxe combat between two armored knights, not peasant soldiers, but trained nobility, dueling with this weapon by choice. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part is why knights preferred it over the sword many assume was their primary weapon. Against another man in full plate, a sword had become almost a last resort. The poleaxe offered range, force, and precision all in a single design. It wasn't a backup weapon, it was the upgrade. And this is where everything changes, because the poleaxe wasn't just built to kill. Some historians argue it represents a turning point where European weapon design stopped treating armor as an obstacle to work around and started treating it as a problem to be engineered against directly, deliberately, systematically. Which brings us to a weapon born from a very different world. Not the tournament grounds of nobility, but the desperate battlefield tactics of common infantry. Number 5. The halberd. The year is 1315, Morgarten, Switzerland, a narrow mountain pass between a lake and steep forested slopes. You're standing among a small force of Swiss Confederates, farmers, herdsmen, common men with almost no cavalry and none of the wealth of the Austrian nobility marching toward them. The Austrian army is larger, better armored, mounted knights leading the charge. By any reasonable military logic, this should be a massacre. You can hear the horses before you see them, hooves on frozen ground, armor rattling, the low rumble of a cavalry charge building toward you. The Swiss line doesn't break. It doesn't even move. Men are gripping shafts taller than themselves, angled forward, waiting. Here's where it gets strange. The Swiss won. And one of the weapons historians credit as central to that unlikely victory is the halberd, a long pole weapon combining an axe blade, a hook, and a spike, all mounted on a shaft that could stretch 6 feet or longer. The axe blade could cleave through armor with enough downward force. The hook could drag mounted knights off their horses entirely, a devastating equalizer against cavalry. And the spike on top could finish an opponent once he hit the ground. Historical accounts describe Swiss halberdiers using the terrain itself as a weapon, funneling armored cavalry into narrow mountain passes where horses couldn't maneuver, then using halberds to pull riders down where their own weight and armor worked against them. But the next discovery was even stranger. Swiss halberd tactics became so devastatingly effective against armored knights that within decades, Swiss mercenaries were among the most sought-after soldiers in Europe, hired specifically for their skill with this weapon. Later battles, including Sempach in 1386 and Grandson and Merton nearly a century after that, would reinforce the same pattern. Disciplined blocks of halberdiers repeatedly breaking forces that, on paper, should have overwhelmed them through sheer wealth and armor alone. A tool built by common infantry with no formal armory, no royal patronage, no nobility behind its design. And it may have single-handedly reshaped how European nations thought about the future of warfare itself, away from the mounted knight and toward disciplined infantry formations. Which raises the bigger question historians still study today. Was the era of the armored knight ended by a rival's better armor, or by a peasant's pole weapon. Number 6. The Goitendag. The year is 1302.
Flanders in modern-day Belgium. The Battle of the Golden Spurs. You're standing among Flemish militia, weavers, guildsmen, townspeople. Facing you, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, French knights, considered among the most feared armored warriors alive. The Flemish have almost no armor, almost no cavalry of their own, and in their hands, something that barely even looks like a weapon. A thick wooden club, roughly waist to shoulder height, topped with a single iron spike. This is the Goitendag. You watch a weaver, not a soldier, a weaver, a man who was making cloth a season ago, grip the club with both hands as a wall of French cavalry closes in. There's no formation drilled into him over years of training. There's just a spike, a heavy shaft, and the men standing on either side of him, refusing to run. Here's where it gets strange. Its name, in Middle Dutch, is believed by many historians to translate to something close to "good day," possibly a grim, ironic greeting delivered as the weapon struck. Though some historians dispute this translation entirely, arguing it may derive from older Dutch terms for a pole weapon, unrelated to any greeting at all. We genuinely don't know for certain. What we do know is what happened on that battlefield. Flemish militia, using little more than sharpened farm tools and improvised spiked clubs, defeated one of the most feared armored cavalry forces in Europe. So many golden spurs, the symbol of French knighthood, were stripped from the dead that the battle earned its name from the spoils alone. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part is how simple the weapon actually was. Unlike the poleaxe or the bec de corbin, engineered by professional armorers, refined over generations, sold to wealthy nobility, the Goitendag was crude. A weighted club with a spike, something a blacksmith or even a farmer could produce in a single afternoon. And it still worked. It still put some of the best armored soldiers in Europe on the ground. Which means the anti-armor arms race wasn't only happening in noble workshops and royal armories. It was happening in the streets, in the guild halls, among people history rarely credits with military innovation at all. Number 7. The Rondel Dagger. The year is 1450, a battlefield somewhere in Central Europe, in the exhausted aftermath of close combat. You're standing over two figures locked together on the ground, both fully armored. Neither can effectively swing a sword or axe at this range. They're too close, grappling, pinned against each other in the mud. And in one hand, something small and almost silent. A narrow blade, a disc-shaped guard, a disc-shaped pommel. This is the Rondel Dagger, and it may be the most quietly terrifying weapon on this entire list. There's no swing here, no room for one. Just two exhausted men, chest to chest, one hand gripping the other's helmet, the other hand working a thin blade toward the smallest gap either of them has left exposed. It's almost quiet, almost intimate. Nothing like the wide, dramatic strikes of a hammer or axe. Here's where it gets strange. Every weapon so far has relied on power, leverage, or reach. The Rondel Dagger relies on none of those things. It was a weapon of last resort, carried by knights specifically for the moment a fight collapsed into desperate close-quarters grappling. Its narrow, rigid blade was built for exactly one purpose: finding the small gaps between armor plates and driving through them at point-blank range. The eye slits of a visor, the joint at the armpit, the narrow seam at the throat. Historical fencing manuals describe entire grappling systems, called Ringen in German sources, built specifically around controlling an armored opponent's body, just long enough to create an opening for the dagger. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part is what this weapon reveals about the reality of armored combat. A reality far removed from the clean, heroic sword duels most people imagine. Real combat between armored knights, according to surviving manuals, often ended not in a dramatic sword strike, but in two men grappling on the ground, hunting for a 2-inch gap in each other's armor with a small blade. Brutal, intimate, almost silent. And it wasn't only European knights who understood this principle. Number 8. The Horseman's Pick.
The year is the 15th century, Eastern Europe, near the frontier where European and Ottoman military traditions repeatedly collided. You're watching two very different cavalry traditions clash, heavily armored Western European knights and highly mobile Eastern horsemen who prized speed over weight. And in the hands of Eastern European and Central Asian cavalry alike, a weapon strikingly similar in purpose to the warhammer that opened this story: the horseman's pick. You watch a rider close the distance at a full gallop, pick held low, then rise at the last possible second as he passes his target. There's no second swing, no follow-up strike, just one moment of contact, timed perfectly, and then he's already gone, already 20 yards past, already lining up for the next pass. Here's where it gets strange. Unlike the two-handed warhammers used by European foot soldiers, the horseman's pick was designed to be swung one-handed, from horseback, at speed, using the combined momentum of rider and mount to drive a narrow, curved spike through an opponent's armor in a single passing strike. Similar weapons appear independently across multiple cultures and centuries, from European cavalry forces to Central Asian horse warriors, all converging on nearly the same design without necessarily learning it from each other. A hammer face for balance and blunt force, a curved spike for penetration, engineered specifically to punch through both plate armor and the mail worn beneath it. But the next discovery was even stranger. Weapons historians studying these convergent designs have pointed to something unsettling: multiple, unrelated cultures arriving at a nearly identical solution to the exact same problem: armored opponents, independently of one another. Not because they copied each other, because the physics only allowed for a handful of real answers. Surviving examples, recovered from battlefields and burial sites stretching from Poland to the Eurasian steppe, show remarkably similar proportions. A short haft for one-handed control, a narrow spike optimized for penetration over cutting, and a balance point designed for a single decisive strike rather than a prolonged exchange. Different blacksmiths, different languages, different centuries, the same weapon arrived at independently again and again. Which means this entire list, hammers, hooks, spikes, needles, and clubs, spanning Switzerland to Flanders to Central Asia, may not really be 8 separate inventions at all. It may be one single idea, discovered again and again by different people in different centuries who all arrived at the same brutal conclusion.